And I'm very pleased, again, as a kickoff to this 4 or 5-year grant period, at least, we hope, to have Secretary Vickers here today. And so let me introduce them and describe a little bit about the format. As you can see, they're in the sort of semi-formal discussant format. So body language should tell you a good deal about what's about to happen. What we have here is our interviewer, who is my colleague Peter Fever, who's a professor over at Duke in political science and public policy. He's currently the director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies and also of Duke's program in American Grand Strategy. He served as special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council from 2005 to 2007, and as director for defense policy and arms control in the National Security Council in 93 and 94. If you're doing your math, that is 2 different administrations and 2 different parties. And he will be conducting a discussion/interview with our guest of honor this evening, Secretary Michael Vickers. From 1973 to 1986, Secretary Vickers served as an Army Special Forces non-commissioned officer, a Special Forces officer, and a CIA operations officer. He had operational and combat experience in Central America and the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Central and South Asia. And in the mid-1980s, Secretary Vickers was the principal strategist for the paramilitary operation involving the Soviet Army in Afghanistan. From 1996 to 2007, Secretary Vickers was Senior Vice President of Strategic Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. From July of 2007 to March 2011, Secretary Vickers served as the first and only Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations / Low Intensity and Interdependent Capabilities. That's a hell of a mouthful, I have to say. In that role, he served as a senior civilian advisor to the Secretary of Defense on counterterrorism, irregular warfare, and special activities. In September 2010, he was nominated by President Barack Obama as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and was unanimously confirmed by the Senate on March 17, 2011. As the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Secretary Vickers is the principal intelligence advisor to the Secretary of Defense. His service in these capacities has spanned the administrations of both President Bush and President Obama. Secretary Vickers holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Alabama, an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in International Relations and Strategic Studies from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming our speaker. Thank you.
Well, it is a great privilege to host you down here, Mike. As you know, we have been friends for a long time, and I thought we would begin by you telling the story of when you were a struggling graduate student working at CSBA and working on your dissertation and pulling your hair out at the way the war in Iraq was going. This would have been 05, 06 timeframe. You and I would meet usually off-site, and you would tell me all the things that we were doing wrong, and that took a lot of time. But then at one point I said, I think the president needs to hear about this, so why don't you pick up the story there?
So first, let me say I was a struggling graduate student for a lot of years. It was a mid-career decision to pursue a PhD, and it took me 17 years. I finally finished it in 2010. Since it took me 3 times as long as normal, I gave them 3 times as much. It was about a 1,000-page dissertation, but I was at least earning a living while I was doing it. So the story Peter tells is during early 2006, as the Bush administration under Steve Hadley and Peter's leadership was looking at strategic options for Iraq, they brought a number of us in to solicit a wide range of views. And so first had a meeting with the president in the Oval Office with a couple of retired 4-star generals who are friends, and then it led to a subsequent meeting at Camp David with some other advisors with the War Cabinet.
Including your dissertation advisor, wasn't that? Including
my dissertation advisor, who was on the opposite side of the issue that I was, but he passed me anyway down the road. There were 3 big options to consider in Iraq at that point. Go big, which became a form of the surge. Go long, which is what I advocated, which was begin a transition to the Iraqis that we could hand off to the next administration and then just go home. And as you know, the president opted for the surge, and then Peter, in his infinite wisdom, said, "So Mike, we liked a lot of what you said. We didn't like the fundamental thing. Do you think you can combine the two with the surge?" And being flexible, of course, I said, "Sure." And certainly turned out to be the right decision in terms of stabilizing a civil war, and certainly in Baghdad, and the transition worked as I had hoped it would across administrations as well.
So one of the things that Wayne left off your biography, but this has enabled you to establish a rapport with the president immediately, was the president just read Charlie Wilson's War. So explain how that created a connection with you.
After the first meeting in the Oval Office on strategy with a group of us, he pulled me aside afterwards and said, "I just read this book, and it's really impressive what you did," and had a bunch of questions for me that was really quite amazing in a sense. He really did read the book in detail, and a lot of specific questions. And then about 3 weeks after that, I got a call from the Undersecretary for Policy saying, "Could you come in and talk about your meeting at Camp David with the then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and him?" As soon as I got in, he said, "We really don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about you joining the administration. President Bush had called over there and said, you ought to hire this guy. And so we're going to create this new position." And Wayne alluded to that in his introductory remarks about this god-awful name of Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict, which is an existing position, but interdependent capabilities, which meant everything else in the Department of Defense that was operational. So nuclear weapons, missile defense, cyberspace, conventional forces. It was the best job in the Pentagon, all the good stuff and none of the headaches. And so it was a great learning experience, and I was very grateful to do that job for 4 years.
So just to finish for those of us who only watched the movie, you weren't in the hot tub scene, right? That wasn't your character. What was your character from the movie?
I was the geek, and very proud of that. And as it turns out, my wife and I got invited to the premiere, and the government ethics lawyer said we could attend. And before the premiere, my wife was telling me, "So if I have to sit in this theater and watch some guy named Mike Vickers with some other woman, you realize you're dead." And I said, "Well, it never happened in real life." She said, "I don't care. You're still going to be dead." So fortunately, I wasn't in the hot tub, and all's well that ends well.
So you had the distinction of serving in both a Republican and a Democratic administration. When President Obama kept Secretary Gates, he also kept you. Can you just talk about the transition between those two? What was that like, given the degree of polarization and partisanship that we see from afar? It must have been a very different experience, or was it a different experience inside?
It was a very different experience. I think, we were, Iraq was fairly stable at that point, on a reasonably good path. But the intensified war against al-Qaeda was just getting underway, and it's something the two presidents handed off between them. And Afghanistan was getting much worse. And again, there was continuity, I think, between the last 6 months of the Bush administration and the first year of the Obama administration in terms of building on the strategy that eventually resulted in the Afghan surge, or actually a couple of surges of forces through December '09. And so, and then also having colleagues from the past like Michelle Flournoy come in as very able Undersecretary Defense for Policy, and my old mentor Bob Gates staying around. It was a very, very smooth transition. As one of the lone survivors, I guess. For that transition, I, with the secretary and the chairman, got to prepare, all the things you need to know, Mr. President, the day you take office, so the nuclear codes and everything else that goes with the job. It's a pretty sobering experience if, you've ever done it in your life, which, like here's the 10 big secrets of the U.S. government that you must know today, so.
So then you got promoted to be USDI, which is also a fairly new post. It hasn't been around for a while. I think most of us know about the USDA, which stamps the beef and things like that. That's not what USDI does, I gather. But can you explain what is USDI and how does that differ from DNI and DCIA and all the other alphabet soup?
I do have a fondness for hamburgers, but so I'm the third USDI. The position was created 12 years ago, and before that, there was no single official in the Department of Defense that had oversight over the vast defense intelligence enterprise. Of the intelligence community, the defense makes up the core of it. It's about 3/4 in dollars and even more in people. And so the USDI is essentially a combination of the DNI with elements of the DCIA. In a sense, you make operational decisions, a final approval like DCIA does for his agency over the Defense Intelligence Enterprise. But what it encompasses is our 4 big agencies: the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, which designs and operates our satellites, and then the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which analyzes the products in the imagery area from those, as well as the intelligence components of the military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and combatant commands. All total, it's an enterprise of some 180,000 people and about $80 billion a year. So it's a big beast.
So we had Admiral Rogers, the Director of National Security Agency and Cybercom, here. What would be your relationship with him? Are you equals? Does he report to you? You report to him? How does that work?
No, so he reports to me as one of the defense agency heads, and on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, as I said, I exercise the authority, direction, and control over the defense agencies, but it's a shared relationship with the DNI. For national agencies. So NSA and NGA and DIA also report to the Director of National Intelligence, who administers the National Intelligence Program. And so the DNI and I work very closely together to make sure we're not giving conflicting guidance.
So,
and then Mike Rogers also has a separate hat. As the Director of the NSA, he is under my purview as well as the DNI's, but he's also the commander of United States Cyber Command. As a combatant commander, he reports directly to the Secretary of Defense in that hat.
So the birth story of USDI, at least one way it's told, is that it was Secretary Rumsfeld's attempt to sort of walk back some of the consequences of the DNI position, that it was part of the friction, or they anticipated friction between Defense Department and the new DNI. How are relations with the DNI, and where would we go to DNI for things, and where would we go to USDI for things?
First, relations are extraordinarily close. Jim Clapper and I have served together a number of years, and we testify together in front of our congressional committees. We do our strategic planning together. We make our budgets transparent to each other. We talk about investments on each side, because so much of what the National Intelligence Program does is critical to the Department of Defense. The department is the biggest customer, and so we will cost share on things that are essentially his program that I believe are very important. But also things that you might consider tactical assets in the Department of Defense, special operations forces, or certain unmanned aerial vehicles, or cyber capabilities are critically important to our national intelligence mission, and we make those available to the National Intelligence Program as well. So we are really joined at the hip. I'm dual-hatted as a deputy DNI for Defense Intelligence, and I think it's the way the system can be made to work. To your question about the creation, USDI was actually created 2 years ahead, but as you probably remember, there was a lot of ferment after 9/11 about, a big run-up to creating the DNI and the Intelligence Reform and Terrorist Prevention Act that took several years of discussion to actually, and there were a lot of false starts and other things. But I think the main motivation, I've talked to Secretary Rumsfeld about this, was really just to gain the Secretary's better control and oversight over this vast enterprise. So I think even if there had not been a DNI, there is a real need for the USDI in DOD. They really serve different functions.
So you've been it now for four going on 5 years. Yeah. What would you say are places where you've advanced the ball, where you would say, yeah, this is something I believe I've accomplished, I and my team, of course, have accomplished, and then I'll ask you where you have fumbled the ball. But first answer where you've advanced the ball.
So like a lot of positions in government, there's institutional aspects to them, and then there's individual aspects, depending on what qualifications you bring to the job and what the Secretary and President want you to do. And so each of us, 3 USDI, Steve Cambone, Jim Clapper, and now me, have emphasized or been asked to emphasize somewhat different things. I spend more time on policy matters. I spend a lot of time at the White House in deputies and principals meetings where we formulate national security policy, and on operational matters, overseeing our operations, particularly counterterrorism operations, but cyber operations of all sorts across the board, because that's what I've spent a lot of my career doing. And the core part of the job, the institutional part of the job, is managing the enterprise and shaping it for the future. And so to answer your question, and a lot of what I did in my previous job carried over a bit with some new things added and some other things jettisoned, but particularly on the operational side. So the big things I would say is the continued effort to disrupt, dismantle, and eventually defeat Al-Qaeda, and something of which I was immensely proud, the operation to bring justice to Osama bin Laden. I spent probably 10 months on that. And then...
were you in Zero Dark 30? We saw that movie.
I was not, fortunately.
No hot tub scene there.
No hot tub scene there. And so a number of operational things, that being really the highlight, and the continued campaign against them, but now Syria and others. And then I would say on the defense intelligence side, trying to adapt the institution to the multiplicity of national security challenges we face in developing the capabilities for everything from cyber threats to continued terrorism threats and instability in the Middle East, to rise of China, resurgent Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a substantial reshaping of the enterprise from our overhead architecture, our satellite systems, to our signals intelligence systems. When I started in my previous job, and as I said, there was a lot of overlap, we had 6 of these combat air patrols, or orbits as we call them, 24/7 coverage of these Predator Reaper drones, as they are called, that do precision strikes in counterterrorism. We have 65 today, and so a dramatic increase. We've had similar increases in other areas in the capacity and capabilities of our signals intelligence system and what it's able to do. We've strengthened our defense human intelligence at a high level with something called the Defense Clandestine Service. And we've made a lot of investments. Unfortunately, most of them are very classified, to strengthen our capabilities to project power in East Asia against, very advanced defenses.
So is there places where you feel like you didn't advance the ball as far as you'd like? And if so, why? What held you back in those areas?
Yeah, so I feel very good about where we are in reshaping defense intelligence through the 2020s and beyond, assuming all these things are sustained. The challenging part has been the inability to bring to closure the global jihadist terrorist threats to the United States, and to bring stability to the broader Middle East. I spent a lot of time on policy and operations, and that work just isn't done. So it's something that's just going to have to continue a much longer period.
So I thought one answer you might give, and so I'll ask you whether this should be laid at the doorstep of Intel or elsewhere, is if USDI and DNI and all the reforms in intelligence were in the wake of the 9/11 surprise and then also the Iraq WMD intelligence failure. In the last year, we've seemed to have been surprised, around the globe, whether it's Putin's adventurism in Ukraine or the sudden rush of ISIL. Is that a misperception that in fact we're not getting surprised as often, or are we surprised as often as we always had? Is that intelligence fault? Do we need to spend more money? Do we need to do things differently?
Well, some say there's really, two conditions in life or in government: policy success and intel failure.
Yes.
And so with
I was
that,
on the policy side. So
you were on the policy side, so I understand your question. Look, I believe we're in a period of unprecedented instability in the international system, a historic transition of the international system, and surprise is endemic in any event. I'll go out on a limb here with my academic colleagues, but say that, social science doesn't exactly have a crystal ball either. And, the difference between us and social science is that, we have access to some secret sources, but they don't make up for everything. It's said that there are really two basic intelligence problems: secrecies and mysteries. So are secrets and mysteries. So secrets, we want to know what this government is developing or planning to do, or whatever the case. We might be able to get access to that. Not in all cases, and so you get surprised, but, so you can get surprised by your inability to uncover secrets. But we're pretty good at that. The more complex the problem, the more the area of mystery, which is, when this guy lights himself on fire in Tunisia, is he going to spark a region-wide uprising that analysts would say, look, this day is coming. A lot of the indicators are there, but I can't tell you it's next week or next month or anything else. I can just tell you that, the Mubarak regime is probably not going to last forever. It's got a lot of weaknesses, but a month later, that's a bit of a mystery. And so I would say, and much like, the IC did a much better job in the end game than people give it credit for with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was fairly late in coming. It isn't something that was foreseen 5 years earlier or a decade earlier. It was in the very, very end game, and there was still a lot of debate about it. And so, things like, I would say, political instability. Ukraine is a good example. That Yanukovych would pack up his bags and give up is something that surprised a lot of people, including Putin. Individuals make decisions like that. And so that's one of the harder analytical problems, when they get to the societal level or region-wide level. So both of those cases. And then on the ISIL side, the challenge there is really, and I would say Yemen is a similar problem, but do you understand well enough the cohesiveness of the society and particularly its security institutions? And so I think perhaps some judgments weren't, it wasn't so much that we got wrong ISIL's ambitions or its capabilities, we got wrong the Iraqi army's willingness to resist after $25 billion of U.S. investment in it. So, it surprised some folks.
So another mantra is that intelligence failures get known, intelligence successes don't often get known. But can you point to an intelligence success where you think that the reforms like USDI, ODNI, and the substantial increase in investment dollar-wise, where it paid off, where you can say, yeah, that's an intelligence success because of these reforms that you're allowed to talk about?
Well, sure. So first I would say that like a defense buildup, there had been a big intelligence buildup of the past decade that, sort of peaked in 2011 or 12 or so, much as defense did. But we got a lot of additional capability as well as capacity out of that investment. That produced a much more robust intelligence system that's good across the board. I mean, there is no leader in the world that has anywhere near the knowledge that our president and his top advisors do about such a wide array of challenges. There are no operators in the world, military or otherwise, that have anything like our intelligence capabilities for precision operations. So those generate lots of successes. When you look at it into specifics, things like how well our policymakers are informed about what certain countries are doing and therefore can craft wise policies. I don't want to go into detail, but in some cases it's been quite decisive. And then in operations, counterterrorism operations are a good example. They are 100% intelligence driven. And so finding someone who doesn't want to be found, bin Laden being the prime case, but lots of others, and then being able to capture or kill them or have direct local forces to them. We have disrupted countless plots around the world, and it's all been driven by these intelligence capabilities.
So you mentioned the substantial investment the United States has made.
And I would say the same thing was true in the 1980s. There was an even bigger investment in intelligence than there was in defense, the famous Reagan buildup, and it produced a lot of results by the end of that decade.
So you've mentioned the substantial increase in investment that the U.S. has made. Have our allies made a similar investment? And if not, does that mean that sort of the gap between us and what our partners can do is growing? I'm thinking about the other movie everyone's watched, The Imitation Game. The U.S.-UK special relationship was forged in intelligence. Are we sort of leaving our allies behind in that area?
Well, I mean, the U.S. kind of organizes the global system of lots of partners, and we have some special partners who also have global capabilities, the Brits being the prime example, that punch way above their weight in terms of relative to other aspects, size of their economy, size of their defense budget, et cetera. Intelligence is a priority area for them as well as domestic security, and they're very, very good at it and a critical partner for us. But in general, in a lot of areas, the U.S. is in a class by itself worldwide. It's just that it has so many different threats to contend with. It's a one on several game. But I would say in intelligence, you generally get a bigger bang for your buck than you do with defense. So disrupting terrorist threats, a lot of Middle Eastern partners are very, very effective partners for us in terms of being able to find someone and arrest them, compared to what that government could necessarily do in terms of projecting military power. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. is able to orchestrate that.
So you've mentioned the array of threats that we're facing. They also seem to cluster into two categories. There's the traditional threats. I mean, Putin's operations in Crimea look almost 19th century, not even 20th century in some respects. Rise of China and what they're doing in the South China Sea. So that's one category. And then there's ISIL and Ebola and cyber, all the untraditional. I know you have to prepare against both of them, but which keeps you up at night more? Which is the one that you feel is the more ominous threat, the more difficult one, or the one where we need to prioritize?
Well, I mean, they all do for different reasons, and they do collectively. So one, I don't think we've seen such a robust array of threats as we do today. And Jim Clapper, I think, would tell you the same thing, and Michael Morrell, former deputy director at CIA, and others. And then the second aspect to it is that unlike the Cold War, a lot of these threats that you enumerated are likely to be enduring ones. They're not, in the Cold War we had one big threat and a series of episodic crises. Most of those you talked about are likely to, be fairly enduring. So I would say, and then a third aspect to this is that not all of them, but most of them have a highly asymmetric character to it, which makes the direct application of American power more challenging. And then in a number of these areas, our adversaries enjoy favorable cost balances against us. So they're able to, focus on one area and cause us to spend a lot more trying to counter that challenge than, would be a good strategic exchange. So for example, North Korea, which is losing a lot of its conventional capability in various areas, still has formidable capabilities in some, but with its missile program and nuclear weapons program, causes us to do a lot to try to counter that specific thing. Terrorists do the same thing. Cyber actors do the same thing as well. The probably near-term most dangerous threats to us are really from terrorism, particularly the global jihad, still predominantly Al-Qaeda in terms of a threat to the American homeland.
Not ISIL.
Not ISIL. Now, let me qualify that. They're in a competition for leadership of the global jihad, but what ISIL wants to do, as already declared, is create this caliphate. And so while they want to attack the West and attack the United States, they are more focused on taking and holding the territory that they have, expanding across the region, building their empire, rather than, the strategic theory that Al-Qaeda has had, which is if you cripple the West, the rest will fall. And so Al-Qaeda's capabilities are still more advanced in terms of sophisticated attack. That could change. But right now, ISIL is more of a hybrid threat, more of a half-insurgent group, half-terrorist group, but regional in focus than Al-Qaeda. And by Al-Qaeda, I just don't mean core Al-Qaeda, which is beaten down a lot, but some of its franchises, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and some Al-Qaeda guys in Syria. And then cyber has grown into a multi-actor game that is a threat to U.S. Infrastructure, and it's also a novel threat. It's an area we're learning a lot about how to protect ourselves, how to collect intelligence in this world and do other things. So they're the two immediate ones. And then, you know, on the great power side, you know, beyond Ukraine, where a resurgent or revanchist Russia is going over the next decade or so, I think will potentially pose a lot of challenges for us as it tries to reshape a lot of the European order. The greater longer-term problem in terms of economic heft and capabilities is the rise of China. But while you could have a conflict in the Pacific, a more limited war right now, the real challenge is decades away for us, but it's a significant one. You know, if you look at the 20th century, the United States economy was twice the size or several times the size of any competitor. That won't be true in the 21st century, quite likely. And so, you know, we had better be very innovative 3 decades from now if China continues on its growth trajectory. Elevating up to a strategic level in the Middle East then, you know, beyond the near-term terrorism problem, it's just the instability that continues to give rise to this and creates sectarian conflict, creates instability, but that's a very, very challenging problem, and what measures can bring that under control and, you know, to eliminate, you know, ungoverned areas are being created faster than we can, you know, effectively deal with them. And so, you know, it depends on, you know, if you ask me, am I really in a cold sweat about a problem that I don't see going away for the next 20 years, or one that I think is really the 50-year problem but is the most significant, or the one that's, you know, near and present danger, could hurt someone today? It's all of the above, but for different reasons.
So you don't sleep at all, is what you're saying?
I don't sleep at all.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to sleeping.
So you talked about the investments in technology that in the intelligence space. What about the human element? What's your assessment of the intelligence professional, the caliber of the intelligence professional coming in, the human capital that is populating this? I'm bringing it closer now to the TISS Center.
Sure. So it's really quite good. I mean, it's, you know, people say, you know, how could you get people to work in like cyber, because there's such a private sector demand for that? We have extraordinary people, you know, that can make several times what they make in the government and the private sector, but do it because it's of such importance, and they're really good at it. And then same, you know, for our analysts and our case officers and covert operators and technologists and satellite builders, you know, et cetera. The IC has consistently been voted, you know, one of the top places to work, both in the U.S. government as well as in the Washington area. It's a great place for women. Women make up a significant percentage of our workforce, somewhere between the high 30s to 40 or 50, depending on the agency. It's a great place for immigrants who have become American citizens, as well as first-generation Americans. When you look at the agencies, you see a lot more of that than you would have 20 years ago. You know, and so the caliber is high. I mean, we probably have more mathematicians in certain agencies than several universities put together, you know, with PhDs, and computer scientists and engineers of various types, and you know,
Any political scientists?
we have political scientists, economists, historians, area studies, linguists. You know, and it almost doesn't matter in some of these areas what you come in with, because over the course of time, you're going to move around, you know. So you may be an engineer who works as an analyst analyzing technical systems, and then you may end up building those systems. Or as a social scientist, you may end up later in your career involved in, you know, cyber, all kinds of things. So, you know, some of it requires deep expertise, some of it requires building a intelligence general officer, and so it's it looks a lot like a university, I guess I would say.
So,
but with teeth.
And this brings me to my last question, and then we'll open it up to questions in the from the audience. And there's microphones here and here. Is there one in the back or just here on the sides? Just here on the sides. So come on down if you want to ask a question while I ask my last one. So you said the caliber is high, but we're in the business, the TISS-ICCAE, the TISS Intelligence Center for Academic Excellence, is in the business of trying to make it better. Improve the caliber of folks who might go into the intelligence world, improve the caliber and understanding of folks who might be the consumers, because they're on the policy side consuming intelligence, or improve the caliber of the citizens who are overseeing and critiquing intelligence from outside. So what could we be doing better? What is a priority from your perspective, having now worked on the inside closely to build it from the inside? What are things that people, groups like us from the outside can do?
So I think all of the above, as you said. I mean, I think having courses in, the kinds of problems the intelligence community works on, the options we provide to presidents, for example, in the covert action arena. Sometimes they're very successful, sometimes not, but they're very high leverage. Both the history of intelligence, because on a lot of the things that have been pioneered in that area from, think about this. We have satellites we still use today that go back 30 years in some cases. How many of you have computers or cell phones or anything else that's 30 years ago that's still really useful today in solving, practical problems? So you're on the cutting edge of a lot of things, and I think just given that intelligence is still a secret business and our oversight is by the Congress, having our citizenry understand it better, debate it, because there's a lot of controversial issues, is a very, very healthy thing. Attracting people from various walks of life, and various academic disciplines into the community. It's a great place to work, is a good thing for us. I can't tell you the number of young intelligence officers I've met, first-generation Iranian Americans and others who planned to go to med school and walked by something and said, I've studied science and this is the life for me. It's an important thing to work on. And so I think by making it rigorous academically, but also showing all the policy aspects, much as, you don't have to be a soldier to study or appreciate military history and, or American military policy or national security policy. It can complement a lot of educations, and so I applaud the effort.
Even historians? You could even use historians?
I like I'm a renegade political scientist like you, so I like historians.
Okay, we have someone here.
Great.
And just state your name.
Yes, I'm Luke from next door, from Duke, so thank you, UNC, for hosting us. So we're about 10 years out from the major restructuring of the intelligence community, and it seemed like the thrust of that restructuring was to create more information sharing among agencies, information sharing within agencies, lower classification levels, things like that. What is your assessment 10 years out of where that has gotten us in interagency cooperation? If you could name maybe 2 or 3 remaining challenges and maybe 2 or 3 areas that have really been effective, that'd be great.
Sure. So a lot of the problems that existed on 9/11, foreign domestic divides inside the FBI, some of those had been remedied in terms of intel sharing by the time there were a lot of reforms after 9/11, and Intelligence Reform and Terrorist Prevention Act was more on the tail end of it. So by the time that was created, a number of things had been addressed. But and then on the issue of sharing, I would say, there have been a lot of benefits from that, sharing with 40-some coalition partners in Afghanistan. But we've had a lot of insider threat issues too. And there's always a balance between, sharing and security, or positive collection and counterintelligence that, intelligence agencies struggle with all the time to try to get it right. And it's more like a pendulum. What the ERTPA really did was create the DNI and then the National Counterterrorism Center in the office of the DNI. And the DNI really separated management from the community and certain high analytical functions, briefing the president and managing our national intelligence estimates from CIA. CIA still remains our central intelligence agency, as the name implies, in a lot of areas. And then on the integration side, much of the work that the most important integration, first and foremost, usually occurs within an agency itself, or a transformation of an agency. So, for example, the biggest change probably in U.S. intelligence, and there have been a lot of them, but the biggest one since 9/11 is probably in the FBI. 50% of the FBI's personnel now work on national security issues, intelligence, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, et cetera. Dramatically different FBI today than 15 years ago. Inside an organization like CIA, in my day, when I was on the clandestine side, we had a pretty arm's length relationship with our analysts in terms of protecting sources, a range of things. Today, it's a really integrated agency across directorates with technologists, analysts, and operators. And then across agencies, the power of bringing together like NSA, NGA, and CIA for a problem. I mean, that's how the bin Laden raid was done. It wasn't done by one agency. It was done by three of them working every day together on this problem, and then with our military later. And so then the broad aspects of across agencies, as I said, is the part that usually gets the look by the reform, but it's just part of the puzzle, and a lot of it was, as I say, was already underway. So, it's a healthy thing. I think, before the USDI, before my position, there was no anywhere comparable senior official overseeing this vast enterprise. And so, then it's up to the secretary and deputy secretary, and they got other things to do. We had lots of folks for other things, the Defense Health Program and lots of others, not for intelligence. And as I said, the DNI, people argued about, because the CIA director traditionally did that. One of the arguments is that it was a conflict of interest. Would you favor one agency over the others? And the DNI has been, a little more of a neutral arbiter, but, people are on both sides of that issue. But overall, I would say it's been very healthy, and, it's where we are today.
Are there reforms that still need to be done? To sort of continue Luke's question?
Well, we're struggling. The big challenge before us now is really the public-private partnership in the area of cybersecurity. That's something the government can't do by itself. It's got a lot of challenges to do that, but it's something that's the big legislation that we need, but also sort of societal reform, and it's caught up very much in this broader debate about privacy, which is a critically important debate, as so many things are impinging on privacy through modern technology. It's a very, very large societal question, but it's it's something we have to make some privacy on in terms of and liability and others. But that's probably the biggest. I don't think there are reforms within or across the agencies right now that are lacking.
Thank you very much for being here. Again, I'm Tricia Sullivan. I'm a professor here in public policy and peace, war, and defense. And as you were talking about the threats that keep you up at night, one of the things that I was really struck by is that there was recently a very large survey of political scientists, of academic political scientists, about what they thought were the major threats. The greatest in magnitude, the greatest in likelihood, and overwhelmingly the top threat identified compared to terrorist threats in China and North Korea and nuclear was climate change. And so that's not necessarily a traditional Department of Defense or intelligence area, but we have so many resources invested in defense and intelligence. Where is there a danger of an imbalance when, in focusing on the threats that have been focused on, when potentially there's this threat of climate change that, who addresses that? Why do you think there is that wasn't something that you mentioned?
Sure, that's a great question. So, I mean, the IC does work on climate change. We have, typically Office of Global Issues that look at a range of transnational issues, economic security, energy, and then climate is another. But it's usually in the context of what are the national security or foreign policy implications of it, much as change in the Arctic, has a lot of national security implications. So, for example, impacts on vulnerable states or impacts on other resources that lead to instability. It's where the IC tends to focus rather than, on the basic science. I mean, they have scientists, obviously, as part of their teams, but I would say they're not adding unique value in that area, much as in the area of technology forecasting. They do that as well. It's just private sector has a huge incentive in that area, and so the government doesn't necessarily add enormous insight, I would say, compared to others. Now, on certain technologies that really matter for national security, or and where they can be aided by intelligence reporting that we may have, then the IC can make a pretty big contribution. But so I don't mean to leave it off the list instead of something not to worry about. It's just that it impacts a lot of those other problems in various ways. I mean, one of my big concerns is state failure and conflict generated from that, very, very messy world that would be potentially a big contributor to.
But isn't another way of asking Tricia's question, you talked about the 30 to 50 year problem of the rise of China. Mm-hmm. In that same 30 to 50 year time horizon, the climate change could easily swamp the rise of China in terms of the national security threat. That's basically what the political scientists were saying. So is the government's investment in confronting the 30 to 50 year problem of rise of China, which we gather they're doing pretty well, the investments are being made, are they making a comparable proportional investment in dealing with the rise of the climate change issue?
Yeah, and then the question, I guess, though, would be is how much of that is amenable to the IC versus other parts of the government. And, I mean, if climate change is your classic global problem that you really need to marshal cooperative behavior for, I mean, we can do reporting on someone's not going to cooperate or this or that, but, it's just like we, aid our trade negotiators or others, but it's not as central to the business as the core national security threats. I think it's just aligned with capabilities. It's not, again, it's not really the potential magnitude of the problem. It's what can these capabilities really bring to bear.
We have someone here.
Hey there, Ryan Watts. I'm from the class of 2012, also a political science major while I was here. Spent the last couple of years in DC and lucky enough to be here while you're here as well. A couple months ago, I believe it was in January, the director of the FBI, James Comey, was on 60 Minutes. I'm sure you saw that interview. And he said this. He said, there are two types of big companies in the United States. Ones that know they've been hacked by the Chinese and those that don't know that they already have. So I guess it's sort of a two-part question. Number one, you've already talked a lot about the danger of cybersecurity, but how do you feel about a director like that coming on in front of the nation and saying, we have a big problem and we don't have a solution to that problem? Do you feel like that's a solid move from a political perspective, or do you feel like he maybe if you had been on, maybe you would have rephrased?
Is he fear-mongering? Is that his...
No, I mean, look, he is an extraordinary public servant, and we're really blessed to have him as FBI director. And you know, look, as I said, the cyber threat is multifaceted. It's the theft of intellectual property. It has destructive components. It's a threat to lots of vulnerable critical infrastructure. And there are multiple actors involved in that space. There are reasonably low barriers to entry for a lot of these targets. And as I said, if the fundamental problem is, you know, how do we posture ourselves as a nation to deal with this challenge? It's going to take public-private cooperation to deal with it. And so whether, you know, that's the right venue or some other, you know, the president just hosted a cybersecurity summit out in Palo Alto, and we created a new integration agency, Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center under the DNI. You know, it's up to public leaders to try to build awareness in this area. And that it's a common problem, much like, you know, the climate change issue, in a sense that it requires collective action. It's just not, there's just too many soft points.
So we asked Admiral Rogers this question when he was here, or a variant of this question, but why, if the U.S. has invested heavily in cyber intelligence capability, how is that different from China investing heavily in cyber intelligence capability against us?
Well, you know, cyber is a new tool that's used for lots of things, and you know, there are things that governments do, but you know, one thing the United States does not do is engage in economic espionage, or you know, things to benefit individual American companies or industries or sectors. And you know, that's part of the international order we've tried to create, and other governments don't necessarily comply with that. And you know, you know, from an economic perspective, that really raises the, you know, it's a dead weight cost to businesses. But you know, I don't think it's a world that we really want to go down. I mean, in terms of national security secrets, if it's another tool, then like any other tool, you know, governments will do that. But governments against private sector, you know, is another matter.
Got it.
Hi, my name is Gautam Hati. I'm a sophomore at Duke studying computer science, and I wanted to ask about electronic surveillance intelligence programs. And specifically, a lot of these programs, at least the ones that get a lot of attention, have the potential to touch or in some way, you know, surveil a large number of people, either directly or indirectly. And there's a lot of concern about the fact that, especially within the United States, people don't necessarily, there's not necessarily a consensus around how those programs are run, or whether or not the government should have the authority to run some of those programs. But there seems to be sort of a catch-22, given that a lot of these programs are classified under wraps. So how do you address that sort of dilemma where there's a need for this sort of intelligence, there have to be these sort of broader programs that impact, or that could potentially impact a lot of people, but at the same time, it's hard to have an open dialogue about them because you can't talk about the capabilities.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the nature of intelligence oversight, and that's why in this area, we vest committees in Congress with fundamentally this responsibility. But to your broader question, the intelligence community does not seek to be imprecise in its targeting, to collect vast amounts of data for vast amounts of data's sake, and then and then see if there's something in there. That's a very terrible way of doing business. But in specific cases where one of the problems we had on 9/11 was not knowing that a guy connected to the plot made a phone call from the United States, and he was actually in the United States rather than overseas where we had lost custody of him. That's a problem that you'd like to solve, even if to prove a negative. So if we collect intelligence all the time about threats to the United States, and then we find out that some of those threats are calling the United States, and so then the question is, are they just calling their cousin to check on their dry cleaning? In which case, who cares about their cousin, or is it part of a plot? And so a lot of times it's to prove a negative, and then, as you said, the requirement is to how do I access data that I only need once in a while, and I need for a very specific, narrow purpose. I don't care about anybody else in there, just somebody I need to search for. But you need some mechanism to be able to do that, and then who should be the custodian of that? And so the government would like to have some secondary mechanism, some separate company or private sector take on that responsibility. It's just that liability comes with it and other things, and so it's hard to solve the policy problem right now, or the legislative problem. But it's one we've got to solve.
Over here.
Yeah, I wanted to push you a little bit on the climate thing. I was fascinated by Tricia's question. I think it's really apropos given that we've had a senator stand up in Congress this week and hold up a snowball and say there is no climate change because it's snowing outside. At a certain point, given your role and function in government, does it become your role and function to wave your finger at the Congress and say, you won't listen to the EPA. You, in fact, will forbid the EPA from listening to scientists, which was just passed in the House this week. But we can tell you, as a national security matter, that this is real and it matters. I mean, does it become incumbent upon you as the forecaster for national security risks to do that?
Yes, and we do that. We publish reports on the national implications. We accept that it's real. But I don't think we're the dominant voice in that. I don't, much as, if we were to comment on some social policy or something else, there can be uninformed opinions. How much can the IC lend to that beyond this is a very serious issue and here are some potential implications down the road? But there's lots of other issues outside of national security as well. As I said, people who do these kinds of issues and global analysis write some pretty dire reports. But I mean, that has to, one, it's generally never a good idea for an executive branch official to get up in front of a senator and tell them that they're stupid. But on much as some would like to from time to time. But but I think there's again a wide body of analysis on that area that's available. It's just what policymakers choose to do with it.
I think he's suggesting if you add your voice, then it'll snowball and more. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I'd like to think so, but I.
David Litt, I'm a graduate of Carolina in 1971, about the time this building was built.
Yeah.
This is a question about the nexus of among intelligence, special operations, and popular culture, which we started to talk about on the fringes at least. I had, as you know, I had the honor to serve 15, 16 years ago as the State Department's political advisor in the special operations community, and at that time, it was the ethos of special operators that you didn't write books about special operations, you didn't contribute to movies, heck, you didn't even brag about it or even allow other people to brag about you. Today, it seems like a totally different world where people seem free to be able to write books and write movies about both the special operations community as well as the intelligence community. How do you feel about that, given the span of your career and how that falls in American culture?
Well, I think as you said, I mean, since the late 1960s or 70s, there's been a progression of this, and it's really accelerated, I think, in the last decade. As long as people do it within prescribed channels and processes, so they clear their remarks or submit them for pre-publication review, then, you know, that's their right. I mean, now there may be consequences. You may break the ethos of your fellow operators. You know, you have a unit culture that says, I don't care if everybody said this is unclassified and it's your right to tell your story. We just don't do that. And, you know, then you have to take that into account. I mean, and that's happened with people who've published things that then, you know, get, if not disbarred, you know, get the silent treatment from their former teammates. So I think there's a natural equilibrium. I mean, we do have a problem these days, I think, also with just unauthorized disclosures, and not just the big leaks like Snowden, but it's just people talking incessantly in Washington and elsewhere about things that they shouldn't, that either constrains the president's space, you know, for decision because you're on one side of the policy or something and someone else is somewhere else, or you just can't resist telling some little secret. And you know, there's a lot of harm from our policy that occurs there, actually more so, I think, than the books, because most of the books that go through this review get pretty neutered anyway. So, or at least someone has a chance to look at them very carefully.
So now you make me want to ask the question, what's the biggest secret that you could tell us but you won't tell us? But I won't, instead I'm going to ask the last question. If you've had a remarkable career, you were in the uniformed military, you were in the CIA, you were in the clandestine service, you've been in the think tank, you've been in DOD at different levels. You can't hold a job, basically. You've just gone from one thing one to the other. So that's the kind of career that many of the people in the room might want to emulate, that they might say, I would love to be able to do the things that you're doing or have done. So what is the advice, what is the parting advice you would give to the younger people in the room who would be looking towards a lifetime of public service like you have rendered the country?
Yeah, so I would say public service is a very noble calling, and, you know, obviously experiment, try some different things. It's not too late, you know, a little later in life to come in. We have more and more mid-career people coming into the intelligence community now, but what I found is what I really loved when I was 20 years old and thought I wanted to be, I still love today, 40 years later. And you know, so if you find that, God bless you. You know, I wanted to be a quarterback, and Mark Harmon of NCIS fame beat me out, and so that's why I became a Green Beret. But
well, and the country is very much in your debt for your service, and so please join me in thanking you for tonight and for a lifetime of service.